type of problem that perplexes students. It's finding the domain and range from a graph. And I don't know why people have problems with this, but let's take it apart little by little. First off, if we're going to work with the domain, the only thing we're going to worry about is this x-axis. That's all I care about. We're only going to worry if there's a graph above and below. We're going to start very far off to the left here. Well, how far off to the left are we going to go? Well, this arrow down here that's pointing down is really pointing in two directions. It's pointing to the left, and it's also pointing straight down. For us, right now, since we're only worried about the domain, we're only going to worry about that it's pointing to the left. Well, to the left would be negative infinity. So this graph is going off to negative infinity to the left, and then it's going to come along this x-axis, and the graph will stop right there. As we travel up the graph, here to here, the only x values we're hitting are all of these, up to that open circle, which happens at -1. So when we look at this, we're going to start off with the domain is starting off at negative infinity along the x-axis, and it crawls up until it hits -1. Now that open circle means we're going to have a parentheses there. There's a gap in our domain because there's no graph above or below anything from -1 all the way up to 2. But the graph starts again at 2 down here, so we're going to start here at 2, and we're going to have a graph all the way out this x-axis. For how far? Well, this arrow represents two directions also. It represents up, but it also represents to the right. Well, how far to the right is this graph going? Well, it's going to go off to infinity. So the negative or the positive 2 is going to be included, so I'll put a bracket, and it's going off to positive infinity. So here is our domain of our function. It crawls along the axis all the way up to -1, then it jumps over to positive 2 and crawls off to positive infinity. Alright, so now let's work with the range. The range is a little different. The range will only be worried about up and down along the y-axis. So we're going to start way down here, and how far does this graph go down? Now remember, we were looking at this arrow before, and we knew it went off to the left, but it also represents going down. Well, how far down does this graph go? Well, that would be negative infinity. So then we're going to crawl up our axis here, and we're going to have a graph to the left, and then here we're going to have a graph to the left and the right. That's perfectly fine. And we're going to keep crawling up. We're going to have a graph on the left and a graph on the right, and it looks like it stops here because, well, the graph kind of stops there. But you have to come over here to this side. This arrow, if you remember right, it represented going off to the right, but it also represents going up. Well, how far up is this graph going to go? Well, positive infinity. So the graph really doesn't stop here. This arrow says it keeps on going. So as we keep on going up this graph, it goes from negative infinity all the way up to positive infinity. So when I talk about my range here, it's really all real numbers. I'm just going to write it this fancy way of positive infinity or negative infinity to positive infinity. And that would be the domain and range of this graph.